It was meant to be the pride of the Luftwaffe, a fast, versatile, technological marvel that would replace the aging war veteran. Instead, it was nicknamed a nightmare for pilots. The aircraft, which on paper promised incredible speed, a pressurized cabin, remote-controlled turrets, and even a dive brake, turned into a disobedient and dangerous machine in the sky. Why did the project, into which all the best was invested, crash with a deafening bang? Who dared to risk it and took it up for a combat mission, despite the threat of spinning out of control? And why did even the legendary British test pilot call it a death sentence in the air? To understand this, you need to watch until the end. Hidden there is the bitterest truth about how ambitions are broken by the laws of aerodynamics. At the beginning of World War II, the Luftwaffe possessed an aircraft conceived as a universal weapon. The Messerschmitt Bf 110 was a heavy twin-engine fighter predicted to have a long career. It could escort bombers, undertake long-range missions, carry a significant payload, and still accommodate a second crew member to divide the duties of pilot and gunner observer. Initially, it seemed like a model of how technology could solve several tasks at once. But it quickly became clear that the calculations for versatility were constrained by the harsh reality of combat. On paper, the range and armament looked impressive, but in the sky against maneuverable single-engine Allied machines, the heavy fighter began to lose. Its two engines and massive fuselage became a disadvantage. It was inferior in turn rate, struggled to gain altitude, and even with all the power of its guns, hitting the target was difficult when the enemy easily slipped out of the line of fire. Thus, the aircraft, which was recently called the workhorse of the Luftwaffe, gradually turned into a compromise. It could perform many functions, but was not the best at any of them. The military leadership understood that in a protracted conflict, such a machine would become a weak link. To maintain the initiative in the air, a replacement was needed, and not just an improved copy, but a new solution capable of withstanding competition in various conditions. The question of the Bf 110's successor was no longer purely technical. It was a choice upon which the effectiveness of Germany's entire aviation doctrine depended. At this moment, two players entered the game. On one side, the usual favorite, the Messerschmitt Company, which already had experience and influence. On the other, the much less prominent but ambitious firm, Arado. This is where the story began, where different approaches collided. The pragmatism of a proven manufacturer and the ambition of a small team to prove that bold ideas could change the rules of the game. Before the Nazis came to power, the Arado firm remained an ordinary private manufacturer, primarily involved with training and reconnaissance aircraft. After its owner refused to join the party and was arrested, the enterprise came under state control. From that moment, its development followed a different trajectory. Profit ceased to be the main criterion, and designers were given the opportunity to take risks and propose bolder projects. Where private companies thought about how to recoup their investment, Arado could afford to experiment. The main driving force was engineer Walter Blum. Even before the competition to replace the Bf 110 was announced, he had conceived an aircraft that would not simply repeat the heavy fighter concept, but would offer something completely new. Blum dreamt of a plane with a pressurized cockpit, remote-controlled turrets, special flaps for stability at low speeds, and even a system that would allow both propellers to rotate even if one engine failed. And although the Ministry of Aviation considered such a design too complex and refused to support it, the very fact of such ideas spoke of the Arado team's desire to stand out against major competitors. When the official race for the Bf 110 successor began in late 1938, everyone's attention was focused on Messerschmitt. It seemed logical that their project would form the basis of the new machine, as the firm had both experience and resources. But Arado decided to take a risk and presented its own development, which was striking in its array of technologies and the boldness of its conception. Thus, the R-240 project entered history, an aircraft destined to travel the path from a brilliant idea to a symbol of how even the most advanced innovations can turn into a failure if they are not based on a solid foundation. When Arado's engineers presented the first blueprints, they looked like a manifesto of the future. The aircraft was characterized by sleek contours and an unusually narrow wing, which in itself seemed a challenge to traditional aerodynamics. To compensate for the loss of lift at low speeds, the designers added fouler flaps and slats. complex elements that could deploy during takeoff and landing, increasing the wing area and making control more predictable. In theory, this allowed for combining high speed at high altitudes with reliability at the moment the aircraft was most vulnerable. The cockpit was designed to be pressurized, which looked like a genuine breakthrough in the late 1930s. The pilot and gunner navigator could operate at high altitude without suffering from breathing problems or pressure changes, making reconnaissance and intercept missions much more realistic. Even more spectacular was the armament, remote-controlled turrets, and crew flying at high altitude didn't have to rely solely on their own eyes and reaction. Special machine gun installations could be aimed using a sighting system, reducing the vulnerability of the rear hemisphere and eliminating the need for bulky hatches with open gun positions on the fuselage. Even the tail section was subject to experimentation. Engineers invented a dive brake that unfolded in the shape of a cone, like an air umbrella. It was intended to stabilize the machine during a steep dive, potentially transforming the heavy fighter into a bomber. This looked particularly appealing to the military leadership. One aircraft could combine several roles. Separate attention was paid to the engines. The Daimler-Benz engines with annular radiators resembled radial engines. Though they were technically inline engines, this shape allowed for better cooling and streamlining, giving the machine a sleek appearance. Bloom even proposed a system for interpropeller drive. If one engine failed, the second, through a system of shafts and gearboxes, would continue to rotate both propellers. The idea was bold, but too complex for mass production, so it was rejected at an early stage. On paper, the R240 looked like an engineer's dream: fast, versatile, protected, with details thought out for any situation, day, night, and even in a dive. All this promised the machine almost unlimited capabilities, but the path from blueprints to the real sky turned out to be much more difficult than it seemed at the time of the presentation. In the spring of 1940, the first R240 prototype took to the air. It seemed that Bloom's dream was about to become a reality, but the very first minutes of flight showed that paper calculations and real-world aerodynamics rarely coincide. The machine proved to be extremely unstable. The most blatant error was that the propellers rotated in the same direction, creating a powerful torque. The aircraft felt like it was constantly being pulled sideways, and the pilot had to continually fight the yaw. Even when this flaw was attempted to be compensated, the problem did not disappear. The aircraft literally rocked on all axes, unresponsive to the controls. The second prototype was little different from the first, adding armament for testing, but it brought no relief. Control remained heavy and unpredictable, and the reaction to the pilot's commands was delayed. Instead of a feeling of confidence, the pilot had a machine that could behave as it pleased at any moment. The designers did not give up. They understood that the aircraft could only be fundamentally changed through a major redesign. Thus, the third prototype was created. The cockpit was moved to the nose, and the fuselage was lengthened. On the tail, a lighter cone with a vertical fin replaced the massive dive brake. Unnecessary elements like the slats were abandoned. They only complicated the design, but offered little help. This version looked much sleeker, and in the air, it did show improvement. Controllability became slightly more predictable, but this did not eliminate the initial problems. The machine was still nervous, demanding the pilot's constant attention and dexterity. Nevertheless, it was risked for a real mission. The third prototype conducted a reconnaissance flight over England and returned with valuable photographs. Its speed was impressive, and its altitude performance was decent. For a moment, it seemed that the designers had found a way to salvage the project. This success gave hope. If even partial stability could be achieved while maintaining high flight performance, then there could be a real future. But the hidden internal problems were only just about to reveal themselves. With each new prototype, the R240 became a more ambitious, yet more contradictory machine. The fourth prototype received more powerful Daimler-Benz engines. Each produced about 1,750 horsepower, and engineers seriously spoke of speeds comparable to the best speed machines of the time. But this was speed bought with complexity. The reintroduced tail brake, under-fuselage bomb bays, and reinforced power plant made the aircraft closer to a bomber than a simple fighter, justifying the development of several series at once. The branched variants A and B were conceived as reconnaissance aircraft. C was a heavy fighter with a reinforced forward cannon installation. A separate version was planned as a night interceptor, and F as a heavy fighter bomber with even greater payload and armament. Yet, as mass and firepower increased, one thing became clear. The machine's basic ailment, aerodynamic instability, was not receding. Increasing the fuselage length and wingspan, attempts to correct the center of gravity and reinforce the stabilizers yielded local improvements, but new flaws were revealed in the new configurations. Engine failures due to overheating, quirks during high-speed maneuvers, and sudden stalls in critical regimes. The annular radiators and complex air intakes promised better cooling and less frontal area, but in practice, the engine's thermal regime remained a problem, especially on long missions. When combat versions with heavy cannon batteries and remote turrets began testing, another issue emerged. The features meant to make the machine universal collectively increased the demands for meticulous aerodynamic and structural tuning. Where one modification mitigated one problem, a new one appeared, and so it went in a circle. In early 1943, as one of the heaviest modifications was entering testing, it became clear that even with increased speed, the primary issue of controllability remained untamed. It was a sad but important reminder. Add as much technology as you want, but if the machine doesn't obey the pilot, all advantages turn into an illusion of effectiveness. By the middle of the war, it was evident that the AR-240 had become a symbol of the struggle of technology against the fundamentals of flight practice. The aircraft received newer engines, but each time with the increase in power, the old problem returned. Overheating. The annular radiators looked effective, promising even cooling and reduced drag. However, in real conditions, the engine stubbornly failed to withstand prolonged operation at maximum power. Engineers patched the system, but overheating remained chronic, undermining confidence in the machine even on the ground. Aerodynamics seemed to be playing a cruel trick on the designers. The narrow wing and sleek fuselage did provide high potential at high speeds, but as soon as the speed was lowered or the aircraft entered an active maneuver, it began to behave unpredictably. Rocking on the axis, sudden stalls, strange vibrations during G-loads. Pilots complained that the machine seemed to have a life of its own and was unforgiving of errors. Even lengthening the fuselage, reinforcing the stabilizers, and changing the wing shape failed to make it truly obedient. Production also didn't inspire confidence. Arado was much smaller than giants like Messerschmitt, and every modification was hard-won. Where mass production was needed, compromises had to be made. Some functions were removed, some materials were substituted, and consequently prototypes often differed from each other more than expected. This turned the entire project into a protracted experiment, not a ready-for-the-front weapon. Formally, the decision to halt work was made in late 1942. But inertia and the belief that its unique speed could still justify itself dragged the project on until mid-1944. Meanwhile, as if to mock it, its direct competitor, the Messerschmitt Maré 210, suffered from the same growing pains. It too was plagued by instability and prototype crashes. Only with the emergence of the Me 410 were errors compensated for and the concept brought to an acceptable state. But by then, the very idea of a heavy fighter had lost its former relevance, and the AR-240 became the ultimate example that no innovations can save a project if the foundation, controllability and reliability, is not resolved. Despite the project being effectively considered a failure, individual AR-240 units did manage to fly combat missions. Several machines were used as reconnaissance aircraft. They flew missions over the Mediterranean and on the Eastern Front, where range and altitude were required. In these roles, the aircraft demonstrated its strengths. Speed and ceiling allowed it to evade pursuers, and the cameras brought back valuable intelligence. But such episodes were few, and almost every flight was accompanied by anxiety. Would the engines last? Would the airframe begin to wobble again in the air? Only a handful survived until the end of the war. One aircraft fell into Allied hands, and the British took an interest in this machine. The legendary test pilot Eric Brown, who had experience with dozens of captured aircraft, flew it. His verdict was brief and merciless. Excellent speed, decent armament, but absolutely unflyable control. The aircraft literally fought the pilot, and no numbers could atone for this flaw. Yet, even the failure left a mark. The pressurized cabin, remote turrets, and dive brake all became experience that later found application in other designs. The R240 demonstrated that bold solutions can be important, but they are worthless without a debugged foundation. The machine became a lesson for designers. Speed and armament impress in specifications, but real value is determined by a simple quality: obedience in the pilot's hands. This lesson proved to be much more enduring than the fate of the aircraft itself. The R240 remains in history as a loud lesson, not because it was utterly useless, but because it showed the cost of misplaced priorities. The machine showcased a mass of brilliant ideas: a pressurized cabin, remote installations, streamlined air intakes, a dive brake. But all these features functioned like ornaments on a sickly frame. Beautiful, but useless if the engine and airframe lacked order. The main conclusion is simple and harsh. Innovation without fundamental tuning turns into dangerous ballast, because in aviation, the basic obedience of the machine is more important than any set of bells and whistles. What does a tuned foundation mean in practice? Its accurate center of gravity and predictable aerodynamics. Its control over the engine's thermal regime and reliability of fuel supply lines. Its stabilizer sizes and shapes that prevent the aircraft from trying to live its own life. It's also uniformity in production. When parts are interchangeable, when every batch is tested identically, the number of anomalies decreases and pilot confidence grows. The R240 suffered in all these areas simultaneously. The multitude of functions required fine-tuning, and there were problems with materials, technology, and logistics. Nevertheless, the most important legacy of the project cannot be measured solely by a list of defects. Some technical solutions showed their viability and later became the norm. The experience with pressurized cockpits provided an understanding of how to organize comfort and achieve high altitude. Remote turrets, though difficult to control, demonstrated a direction. Automated fuselage defense can be effective with reliable aiming and communication systems. Dive brakes demonstrated a way to resolve the conflict between diving speed and target approach safety, provided the machine itself can handle the speed range and doesn't stall at critical regimes. The transition from failures to successes did not come from one magic solution, but from consistent work on the basics. Designers whose machines showed acceptable stability first simplified the wing geometry and chose compromises that reduced the severity of stalls. They reinforced the tail assembly and revised the center of gravity, making it less sensitive to changes in load. They prioritized cooling and engine reliability, even if it meant some loss of peak speed. Production lines standardized components, and during the experimental phases, more prolonged flights were conducted to detect hidden defects. Through such sequential steps, the models that followed retained some of the promised potential, speed and range, and at the same time ceased to be nervous. The Me 410 illustrated how to retain ambition but build it around a solid foundation. Improved aerodynamics, established engine units, attention to center of gravity, and quality of assembly. In the post-war period, this principle was repeated again and again in heavy interceptors and multi-role aircraft. Predictable behavior is achieved first, and only then are electronics and armament added. The R240 left one final, almost literary touch. Without discipline in the foundation, any technological novelty risks driving the project into a dead end. This lesson serves as a bridge to the next analysis, an examination of the recipes for stability that truly worked and the price paid for them. The more expensive the set of features, the stricter the check of the basics. And it is in this journey from a fashionable blueprint to a rigidly debugged machine that true engineering wisdom lies.